a culture hero or a role model or anything like that. You know, I don't want it to be the absolute last word in what the trendy style is.
Imagine the scene. Los Angeles, 1979. Backstage at the pianist's legendary troubadour. Guitars blast out soundcheck. Drinks are being poured. Legends are in the hallways. Then chaos. A young assistant bursts into the promoter's office, shaken, breathless. Linda Ronstadt has just stormed out of the green room again. And the reason? One name listed on the strength of performance. Not Linda Ronstadt, not the Eagles, his. She saw the name and left. No confrontation, no questions asked, just cold and silent. For years, no one knew what had taken place that night. Linda never offered an explanation. No public spats, no tabloid-worthy tantrums, just meticulously perfect interviews and a carefully crafted veneer of poise. The silence was preserved for decades, until now. In an uncharacteristic moment of vulnerability, Linda Ronstadt is ready to disclose the 7 musicians she has never forgiven. The 7 who bruised her ego, challenged her craft, and revealed the darkness of the music industry. And the list. It's not what you think, a petty spat or fading resentments. These are stories that epitomized an entire chapter of rock and roll power plays, broken alliances, and quiet retribution. The most amazing part of some of the names on the list were once Barbara's closest subordinates, if not allies. Leading the list was a drummer who became a superstar, whom used Barbara as a springboard, then completely stepped on her. And if you think you know who it is, think again. The drummer who became too big for his own beat. Before the Eagles became rock royalty, Don Henley was nothing more than Linda's drummer and backup singer, grateful for the light she shone upon him. At the beginning of the 1970s, Linda Ronstadt was the rising star, selling out theaters from coast to coast. Henley was the relatively quiet guy behind the kit, riding the momentum built on Linda's fame. She gave him his first great break, but suddenly became nothing like the humble musician she could remember once rising from. His ego multiplied with the band's success. The group that once opened for Linda all went strutting down Sunset Boulevard as if they owned it. Henley in particular began to strut his stuff like he was the king of the canyon, dismissing the woman whose career he made. The first time he publicly disrespected Linda was 1975. Backstage at the Universal Amphitheater, Henley made a comment that still stings. He taunted Linda's musical direction when he was asked about her music, with a deliberately rotten segue into defecating on Linda's choices as an artist. He sneered, "Why do you think she should be writing her own songs? She should stick to covers and leave writing songs to real writers." At that moment, Henley's comments were not just disrespectful, but dismissive of everything that Linda built up with hard work, passion, and talent. Linda was not just disgraced, she pulled Henley's tour pass on the spot. There would be no second chances. Rumors would circulate throughout the industry that Henley had slipped way too far, and someone needed to step up to his plate. Friends and Roys would mutter quietly about his cocaine-drugged rage tantrums, his ego and misguided decisions, and his malicious words behind closed doors. What irked Linda the most was not necessarily that he betrayed her. It was Henley's disrespect. Later, in private, she would refer to him as merely as a climber who lost his soul in the pursuit of fame. But Henley hadn't been the only one to cross the line, because Linda's next fight, if it were won, didn't take place in the quiet of an after-party backstage. It happened with the audience witnessing every second, with a drunk frontman, with the microphone he'd commandeered, and with a moment of public embarrassment so big she could never get over it. The night Jim Morrison crossed the line. It was 1968. The summer of love may have ended, but the madness hadn't. The Doors were vivid, lighting up every stage they passed like wildfire. And Linda Ronstadt was still in there fighting for every inch of ground in the male-dominated world of rock and roll. That night, at a private after-party right next to the Whiskey A Go-Go, legends and screw-ups mingled. But nobody could predict what would happen next when Jim Morrison happened upon Linda. He was already 3 sheets in, shirt half open, strutting along like a peacock, enjoying the audience of people who were there to see him. In a moment of insanity and bravado mid-performance, Morrison pulled Linda on stage. It was unplanned. It wasn't cute. It was wildly irresponsible. And then he leaned in. Right in front of everybody, he decided he would try to kiss her. Linda flinched away. She had an immediate reflex to this, and Morrison lost his balance, fell into her mic stand, and almost tipped the entire rig over. There were audibly gasps. People stared. People whispered. The crowd didn't know whether to laugh or to freak out. The moment never made it on film, but it became an underground legend. Backstage and through stories told late night on radio shows, it was swapped back and forth for years to come. Morrison never apologized. In fact, he went the other way. Months later, on a radio interview, when mentioning Linda and her performance, he teased her and called her sweet but a coward. He discarded her as passive and forgettable. Linda made no response publicly. She rarely did. But in her inner circle, she made heavy words. She called Morrison a brilliant wreck, a poisoner of everything near him. For Linda, he wasn't just an act of a crazed performer. He was an alter ego of the toxic masculinity that tried to take ownership of every inch of the music business. And while Morrison's behavior inflicted emotional bruises, the next great betrayal would not be coming in slurred words or drunken kisses. And so it came during a moment of solidarity in which Linda, in her mind, thought she was with friends for a cause she believed in and a movement she had put her career on the line for until her fellow channeler of protest turned on her once the protest turned personal, Neil Young. It was 1976. A benefit concert for farm workers had brought together incredible rock and roll performers, including 2 groundbreakers known, not only for their voices, but for their conviction. And that bridge is contradicted by the likes of Linda Ronstadt and Neil Young. For a moment, they were colleagues in arms for a cause in which they both firmly believed. All positive and proactive until that moment, under the bright lights, turned everything upside down. The backstage pomp and circumstance spiraled as Neil dismissed Linda's input as an artist and treated her poorly, including dismissing her set ideas, blocking her from performing individualist songs, dismissing her sound as too commercial, and to top it off, he told the press after the concert that Linda was for him protesting. She certainly wasn't another artist who reflected that. Very clear, Linda was doing enough to manage the moment, but she just wasn't real enough to really fight it out. She left the venue in tears. Why? It wasn't merely an insult to her activism. It wasn't merely an insult from someone whom she had respected, whom she believed fought for. She was being painted hollow by a fellow activist, and there was no deeper betrayal that hurt worse than someone she looked up to, and who she believed stood for the same values, devalued her authenticity as an activist. That night was a turning point. From then on, no matter how good the cause to reform the world was, she wouldn't share a stage with Neil Young again. While with her closed friends, she referred to him as loud as a lion in message, and as cruel in his execution. To Linda, his activism was hollow, dampened by the type of arrogance that she was taught to change. But if that personal moment shook her, the next one would be artistically devastating. Because that next betrayal wouldn't be sheer backstage politics or just a statement made publicly. It would come in real time, in the middle of studio session in front of a full room of musicians, where Linda would be stripped of her confidence by the chilling statement. When genius becomes cruelty, Frank Zappa. Their meeting in 1974 had the flair of something iconic. Frank Zappa, avant-garde, unpredictable, the mad genius of experimental rock. Linda Ronstadt, genre-defying, vocally unstoppable, and coming on like a freight train, was a distinctive and fascinating collaboration in the making that had every chance of satisfying something much larger and truly revolutionary. That it ended disgracefully when at worst Julie's perms barely saw open the day, within a few hours is a pity. It began with some promise. Linda had shown a legitimate eagerness to record one of his songs, but as soon as they hit the studio, the wheels fell off. Zappa dismissed her artistic suggestions with a smile, told her she brought a sanitization to his sound, essentially accused her of attempting to make something watered down that would take raw art and make it a jingle for cars. Once they got to rehearsal and being so prepared, at the apex of the session, Zappa stopped the band cold. We all froze while in the middle of rehearsing a live show, and in front of everyone he sneered. This is what happens when you give real music to a pop singer. We froze. Linda didn't yell or scream or argue at all. She just quietly packed up her things and left, feeling humiliated, hurt, and finished. She never returned, and she never worked with Zappa again. She told nobody, publicly, but close friends remember her speaking on it. She called Zappa brilliant but savage, a mind she respected, a man she could not trust again. She called working with difficult artists creatively challenging. That was one thing. But what came next? That hurt much deeper. Because the next name on the list wasn't some abstract genius or disorderly frontman. It was someone she thought of as family, a fellow originator who had renounced that connection at the most critical juncture. The fallout of Laurel Canyon. David Crosby. Linda Ronstadt and David Crosby used to think of one another as kin in the mythic golden fog of Laurel Canyon. The two had a mutual association of musical implication. They had shared stages and studios, but more importantly, they had shared an informal sensibility that stemmed from their participation in both the origin of and trajectory of the countercultural process. Crosby's harmonies and Linda's genre-spanning vocals represented a moment in time. In those days, their connection felt unseverable, but by 1978, their harmony had dissolved to tension. During a vocal session for their collaborative song, Keith Hartley Band, she made a request for a key change, one that was more suitable for her voice. But astonishingly, he refused, dismissing her suggestion with a flippant remark, "You should learn how to adjust." What had started as a little foy-fi had turned into a hot mess. They exchanged heated words, and the argument traveled beyond the studio. Within days, it appeared in the press, transforming into one of the most talked-about fights in the canyon. But that didn't stop there. Crosby went even further, making allegations in Rolling Stone, suggesting she was a manufactured product, not a real artist or craftsperson. For an artist who had based her entire career upon raw talent and intuition, it was a knife to the heart. While she hadn't responded in any interviews, not ever, her silence wasn't passive. She would make a quiet but explicit move. After the falling out, she outlawed his name from her band and inner circle. She even instructed studio musicians to avoid references to him. Every trace of his music was removed from her tour set list. As far as Linda was concerned, this person no longer existed. Crosby had done more than simply betray a friendship, in Linda's eyes. By betraying her as a friend, he also betrayed the collective ideal that defined what Laurel Canyon used to be. Privately, she labeled him as the signaling deviance of a person elevated to great heights and perpetually spoiled due to ego, chronic drug abuse, and celebrity status. Although Crosby's betrayal was personal, the next item on her list felt colder. A public affront that was punk poetry used as weaponized spite. Punk provocation. Elvis Costello hurling a public insult. It was 1979 and Cleveland was all ablaze. A big festival cooled together all the icons and up-and-coming talent. A headliner called Linda Ronstadt had just finished a 2-album run of consecutive #1 albums. At the time, she was at her absolute peak, a tidal wave. That night, every set of eyes was on her, and one of those eyes belonged to Elvis Costello, the new boy on the scene. Brash, brilliant, hardly cuffed. The intellectual punk rock rebel with a chip the size of an ashtray on his shoulder. A new sound that wasn't likely to be lost on the reporters on hand. But nobody, probably not even Elvis Costello himself, expected that he would do what he did next. In front of a gaggle of reporters, Costello sneered that Linda's performance was the background music for brunch. It was more than an assail on her performance. It was outright humiliation. The jabs spread like wildfire, and when Linda finally found him backstage, she was hoping for a little clarity, or maybe even an apology. That was not what she got. Apparently loaded and full of himself, Costello calmly looked Linda square in the eye, dropped another C above cold comment, and wandered off without even a hint of regret. For Linda, Costello was one thing and one thing only. He represented something greater than the lone foray into bad behavior by a new artist. He was a new breed of artist, clever but careless, critical but heartless, not just defiant but clearly cruel. It was ego. I felt no soul in his rebelliousness. But on the scale of bad outcomes, there was no comparison. You would have thought it was the last on my list, because the last name was not a well-known rock wildman or brash newcomer. It was the name of someone whose music was supposed to perfectly complement mine. A voice so similar I thought the universe was attempting to put us on the same road together. But the clash was evident behind the curtain, and what could have been a collaboration of dreams was a silent war. Perfection or control. Paul Simon's frigid dismissal. I was so excited in 1982 it seemed a perfect collaboration. Paul Simon, arguably one of the most respected songwriters of the time, and Linda Ronstadt, the reigning queen of genre-defying harmonies. When I agreed to duet on his next album, one could feel the buzz among the fans and industry professionals. On paper, it was a dream collaboration. In reality, it was a slow-motion nightmare. From the moment I walked into what was supposed to be a rehearsal, it felt off. Simon seemed to obsessively nitpick the way I delivered lyrics. He had the sense of urgency to stop my takes because he thought I misinterpreted the phrasing and needed correction. He made changes to lyrics without first consulting me, and even offered advice for the way I might sing that equated to thinly veiled criticism. Those close to Linda have mentioned she later described the experience as being scolded by a principal. Every note she got was scrutinized, not supported. There was no chemistry. The chemistry simply fizzled under the pressure of ego and condescension to moments of passive aggression. The song was placed back on a shelf, unfinished, unreleased, and remained unspoken for years. But for Linda, the issue was not about one track of music. It was being treated as less than. A voice like hers, a legacy like hers, deserved a collaborator. Instead, she got a dictator. After that moment, she silently promised to herself that she would never step into a studio with Paul Simon again. And with that final fracture, Linda Ronstadt's silence on her most painful betrayals had officially cracked open. 7 musicians, 7 scars, all buried behind decades of elegance until now. Because behind every harmony, there is a story most aren't aware of until someone dares to share it. Why it remained quietly what it was for all these years. Linda Ronstadt never has been one to fan the flames of gossip. Deftly, she and her voice let the music speak for itself for decades. But these aren't revelations that center around a vendetta. These are recountings that center around truth. She established her legacy not merely through talent, but the result of surviving egos, betrayals, and a brutal industry. And by finally sharing these stories, she is not destroying anyone else. She is lifting a curtain. Sometimes the strongest part of us is not what we sing, but the silence we break. Which of these stories shocked you the most? And do you think Linda should have kept quiet all those years? Share your comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time.